Hello everyone and welcome to the Drydock episode 368. This week the questions are taken from Guide 435 on HMS Victoria of 1859, the Wednesday video on USS Enterprise CV6, how it came to be in the first place, and the Friday video on the first half of Roll 1 of the Antony Roll, Henry VIII's Great Ships. So let's go on with questions. BK Zhang asks, how destructive was the construction of a single capital ship in the era of HMS Victoria to the environment? A lot of it depends on who's doing the construction, because back in those days, you're talking age of sail, ships built of wood, masts, etc. The vast majority of that ship was made up of what we would today call renewable resources. The sails and the rigging would be made from hemp or cotton, perhaps sometimes in the case of the sails, which is just obviously a plant. It grows, it's harvested, you can grow more of it. And although some metal masts were coming into play, if we're looking at the broader ship of the line period, usually obviously those masts would be made of timber, usually fairly straight, usually somewhat fast-growing timbers. And again, wood is a renewable resource if it's managed properly, especially the kind of quick-growing vertical timbers you'd use in a lot of masts, especially composite masts. The hull, of course, is also made of wood, although will tend to be made of hardwood, so they're much longer in the growth period. So this is kind of the first area where some environmental damage could be done, because, of course, a mature tree, a couple of 100 years old perhaps, will be a fairly integral part of the environment, and you need a lot of trees to build a ship of this kind of size. But that's why I said it depends on the Navy and the time period, because sometimes you would have people just happily chopping down whichever trees they thought they needed, and you could denude entire forests, or in the case of the UK, at various points in history, significantly denude to the entire island of mature trees, which is a fair bit of an impact. At other times, when people were being a little bit more sensible, it was managed. Now, obviously, if you cut down hundreds or thousands of trees to build a ship of the line, that is going to have an immediate impact. But if you're managing it properly with multiple growth stage forests, so that you have a continuous supply of wood, then the impact won't be as great. It will be more on a par with, a major storm or something like that, rather than completely devastating the local ecology. The stuff that has the greatest impact in terms of major portions of the ship's construction would be the guns and the copper plating for the anti-fouling on the underside of the hull, because, of course, those things have to be excavated as raw ores, then smelted down and refined in foundries, which will be burning wood or coal or charcoal, depending on, again, who's making these things. And then you've got to cast them, refine them, ship them, etc. So that could be somewhat destructive, although again, in modern environmental terms, a big hole in the ground, well, a small hole in the ground leading to lots of bigger holes underground, is not hugely environmentally destructive. For copper and iron production of that period, it would be more just the amount of smoke and particulates produced by the smelting and casting processes. John E. 9999 asks, in Warship Special No. 1 Battle Cruisers, the design and development of British and German battle cruisers in the First World War era, the author mentions a number of times that the British and Germans obtained details of the other side's designs. Were their spies that good, or their security that bad? There were a few things in play in these circumstances, one of which was the fact that although secrecy was being tightened up as you went through the 1900s and into the 1910s, there still was something of the legacy of the pre-Dreadnought era and even the era before that, where the specs and statistics and capabilities of new and upcoming warships were very loudly and publicly proclaimed in advance of the ship even being constructed, let alone launched. So some details would still emerge just into the public domain. And of course, much as today, the general public can take whatever the press release says and work with that. But somebody who knows a bit more about ship design, like, say, a naval architect working for a navy on the other side, can, to a certain extent, fill in the gaps and work out some of the additional capabilities, or what they must have done to gain that capability, assuming, of course, that the public statement is correct. So that's one thing. Another thing is that in those times, and to a certain extent even these days, although these days they're a little bit better at it, construction facilities would just, in the middle of ports, very often in commercial yards rather than military yards, although of course there were royal dockyards and the like as well. And that meant that if you were working on a ship next to the latest and greatest battlecruiser, well, you had a perfect view of what was going on, and you probably understood most of what was being done because, well, the fact you're working on a cruise liner or a freighter next to the battlecruiser doesn't mean you don't know how to build a battlecruiser, it just means that's what they've assigned you to do that week, month, year, etc. And, well, if someone comes along and offers you a few quid or a few marks in exchange for your thoughts on what you saw that day when you're down in the pub, well, people are very susceptible to that kind of thing. Another factor is, well, again, these are very big ships in very public yards. Naval attachés, or people on holiday, in big quotation marks, could just take boats and sail past the docks and have a look. And again, a visual inspection from a few hundred yards away might not tell Joe Public all that much, other than it is a ship, or at least part of one, but a trained naval officer or a naval architect will be able to work out from what they're seeing quite a bit about the capabilities of that vessel. There was, of course, a little bit more skullduggery, people trying to get into commercial offices and acquire blueprints and ship's covers and specifications. But as I said, a lot of the time that kind of stuff was either public or semi-public, so you didn't need to be James Bond to acquire such materials. And then, of course, there were the leaks and the misinformation that would occasionally be put out. So when the Invincibles were under construction, for instance, Fisher was very careful to not outright state, but very, very heavily infer that the Invincibles would be all 9.2-inch armoured cruisers, which is why the Germans ended up building Blucher. And then, of course, later down the line, the British made not a massive deal, but just enough of a deal that people vaguely paid attention to what they were saying about their new 12-inch 50 caliber special design, which then turned out to be the 13.5-inch gun, or the 13.5-inch special, which turned out to be the 15-inch gun. You'd think someone would have caught on at some point, really, but never mind. So there was that as well, misinformation, and misinformation could go one way or the other, because, of course, with Fisher's misinformation about the Invincibles, that actually worked in his favour, because it ended up creating Blucher, which was, broadly speaking, an inferior combatant to the Invincibles. So in that case, it worked. But in other cases, for example, during the war itself, the British acquired, in quotation marks, information about new German battlecruisers under construction, which would be the Mackinsons. But the information they had said that the German battlecruisers were capable of well over 30 knots and were armed with 8 15-inch guns, and obviously armoured to deal somewhat with that level of firepower, which was, of course, massively superior in armament, speed, and protection to anything the British were building at the time. Tiger had smaller guns, was slower, and would have less armour. Renown and Repulse would have the same size guns, but 2 fewer. They'd be of roughly similar speed, but they'd be significantly less well protected. And so the British ended up going off and designing Hood and the Admiral class, when in actual fact the Mackinsons were a somewhat more conservative design than what the Intelligence League had said, which ironically enough then in turn forced the Germans to scrap the idea of building lots and lots of Mackinsons and move up to the Ersatz Yorks, which was something akin to the initial leak in that they'd put out in the first place. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, I know that Victory wasn't the largest man of war at Trafalgar, with the Spanish and French both possessing larger vessels, but was Victory the largest man of war in British service? And if yes, for how much longer would she hold that title? If not, what was the actual largest man of war in British service doing that was somehow more important than being at one of the most important battles in naval history? While the French did have ships of the line that were larger than Victory, they didn't actually have any of them at Trafalgar. The biggest things they had were 80 gunners like Bucentaur. The Spanish, though, had a few fairly chunky ships of the line, including Santissima Trinidad, which you can see just on the right-hand side of this picture. Now, Victory was the largest British ship of the line at Trafalgar itself, although only by a fraction. The three-deckers Neptune, Temeraire, and Royal Sovereign were all within shouting distance of her dimensions. Now, of the other first rates under the British flag at that stage that were also bigger than Victory, there were two ex-Spanish vessels, the Salvador del Mundo and the San Josef. The San Josef actually missed Trafalgar only by a little bit because she was part of the Brest blockading force, and so in theory could have been part of the ships that were brought down to reinforce Nelson's fleet when they set up their blockade of Cadiz. However, in the period of the Battle of Trafalgar and shortly before, she'd actually gone back into dock for a refit after having spent quite a long time on blockade duty. Salvador del Mundo, as far as I can tell, appears to have been in the Channel Fleet. Likewise, the British-built Hibernia was also with the Channel Fleet, and so was Ville de Paris, which was a British-built capital ship, slightly confusingly named after the previous Ville de Paris, which was also a first-rate, but obviously a French one, which had been captured. The Royal George was under repairs in Portsmouth, and that was basically that. There were a handful of other three-deckers in the Royal Navy, but they were smaller than Victory. You asked about the ones that were bigger. So essentially the answer is a couple of them were in refit and therefore weren't available at all, and pretty much all the others were in the Channel Fleet. R. de Boer asks, what caused Gloire's sister ships to decay so quickly compared with other ships of that era, and even quicker than the lead ship of the class? Unlike Gloire, the Normandie and Invincible, I think that's how it's pronounced in French, anyway, were built with unseasoned timber, which I kind of suspect was because someone decided to build Gloire, and then somebody else went, hang on a minute, that's a rather revolutionary naval vessel. We should probably build some sister ships rather than having just the one, because we need to get a leg up on Britain. And they went, yes, this is a good idea. We shall order more ships. And then someone went, yeah, about that. You wanted one. We got the seasoned timber for one. We ain't got the seasoned timber for three. Oh, okay, we'll build the next two out of unseasoned timber. Okay, then. And, shockingly, you build a ship out of unseasoned timber, it doesn't last long. I mean, the fact that they lasted, a decade or two is reasonably decent for an unseasoned ship. A lot of ships built out of green timber for the War of 1812 barely lasted out the War of 1812, albeit that did go on for 3 years. But obviously, with the ironclads, the wood was somewhat protected from the elements by, being clad in iron. So that helped, I suppose. Yamato asks, in the Guadalcanal campaign, on the night battle of November the 14th, basically the battle between Kirishima and Washington in South Dakota, there were two other Kongo-class battleships, Haruna and Kongo. They weren't in the Guadalcanal area, but if they joined with Kirishima and company, then Washington and South Dakota might have been more damaged. But did they have any chance fighting three Kongo-class battleships, that's the American battleships, if all three had shown up that night? I think a lot of it depends on who exactly is being targeted, because realistically South Dakota's kind of out of the fight due to her power and radar issues. Now, if all three are present and all three are loaded the way that Hiroshima historically was loaded, so the first few salvos are going to be bombardment rather than armor-piercing shells, that gives the US ships a little bit of leeway. So if we go with roughly the historical scenario, just we have a couple of extra Congos, South Dakota potentially could be in a bit of trouble. the bombardment shells are going to mess her up, but probably not really threaten her watertight integrity. But when Admiral Lee drops the hammer on Kirishima, then by that point, we know that Kirishima was able to fire a few armor-piercing shells before she was knocked out, which would indicate that Kongo and Haruna would be able to lay some armor-piercing salvos into South Dakota, and at that kind of close range, they might do some fairly serious damage. I think what it's largely going to depend on is how fixated do the other two become with shooting up South Dakota. Because if they stay kind of locked on, then as soon as Washington has crippled Kirishima, she can shift her fire to one or the other of the remaining two ships, at which point that's also probably going to be knocked out in fairly short order. And then it's a 1v1, and even if the remaining ship then at some point during that beatdown turns its attention to Washington, well, yes, of course, it can hurt Washington, but this is Washington with Admiral Lee on board. Washington will win that fight. So if you have a situation where the Japanese get very fixated on South Dakota, theoretically Washington is in a capacity where she might be able to win essentially a 3v1 because she's not being fired at for most of it. But that's dependent on a few things. Obviously, dependent on the Japanese captains not just switching their fire as soon as Washington opens up, in which case, at that point, Washington's probably not going to be too long for this world, because by the time she's finished off Kirishima, the other two should be landing salvos on and all around her, which Admiral Lee will probably choose that point to break off, because better to lose one ship than two. And the other big question, of course, is that in the aftermath of mauling Kirishima, Washington made tracks to avoid salvos of long lances which had been loosed by her escorts. What does Admiral Lee do in this situation? Because, of course, the further he draws away, the more that's going to affect his gunnery, because they're maneuvering and, the aiming precision will drop slightly. Whereas if he stays on course to try and finish off the Japanese ships as fast as quick possible, then you might end up with Washington taking a torpedo hit or two. It's very, very variable. So, yes, in theory, Washington might stand a chance, but there are also plenty of scenarios where the Congos, if all three of the survivors are there, might win the day. Art asks, in your opinion, what is the most interesting or most likely what if in the history of naval technology? For example, what if the turret had never caught on and the broadside had therefore remained the norm? So, naval technology-wise, I think one of the most interesting ones would have been what if the torpedo hadn't caught on for whatever reason. It's experimented with, and then they decided, actually, as useful as this is, the technological limitations just make it not worth pursuing. And for some reason, everyone had then forgotten about it going forward. When I'm talking about that, that's the locomotive torpedo, the thing we think of as being fired from submarines. Because prior to the development of the torpedo, you, broadly speaking, essentially just had three main types of warship. You had battleships for the battle fleet and as flagships for foreign stations. You had bigger cruisers for helping screen the fleet, support the fleet, and being flagships on smaller foreign stations. And then you had smaller cruisers, which were your day-to-day, do everything ships, which ranged in size all over the place, and amongst other things would be your general fleet scouts, but also the general port ships in various places. And everything was, relatively speaking, simple. Obviously, there were some smaller vessels than that, but those were your broad types. But once the torpedo got involved, then suddenly you have destroyers, and, torpedo boats, then torpedo boat destroyers, then destroyers, and then you have smaller cruisers to counter those destroyers, and then larger cruisers to do your scouting, then armoured cruisers to destroy those cruisers. Obviously, eventually that'll lead into battle cruisers, but that's not so much to do with the torpedo. But then, to a certain extent, also the pre-dreadnought, secondary, tertiary, etc., batteries come into play. Now, the bigger batteries will probably still come into play with the quick-firing gun development, because that is actually relatively useful in ship-to-ship combat. But all those little anti-torpedo boat guns of the tertiary and further on down batteries probably wouldn't come into play. Now, you might be reasoning, why on earth have you got a picture of HMS Collingwood to answer this picture, Drac? Well, that's because initially I thought the question said, what was my interesting, most likely what if in naval history? I missed the technology bit because it was in the second line. And, well, since I prepared a short answer for that, you're going to get it anyway. So my most interesting potential factoid for an alternate history in just general naval history, at least more recently, would have been, what if that shell that went over the top of one of Collingwood's turrets, where the future King George VI was stationed, had just gone a little bit lower and hit the turret, and thus either crippled or killed the then prince, and therefore we don't have a King George VI. Now, of course, you would still have the abdication crisis of Edward VIII in the 1930s, but if George, or, well, Bertie, as he's actually known, but King George VI, if he's not available, then the crown falls to his brother, Prince Henry. So we would have King Henry IX, assuming he decided to keep his name as his regnal name. And as opposed to having a relatively short reign of King George VI and then a very, very long reign of Queen Elizabeth II, because, of course, Elizabeth wouldn't be around because her father would have died long before she was born. Instead, you would have had, like I say, King Henry IX until the mid-1970s, and then we would currently have a King Richard IV, again, assuming he chose to keep his name, and the next in line to the throne, instead of being a William, would be the first potential King Alexander, which I approve of, at least in terms of a name. Aaron Basham asks, will you be doing any videos on ships from any navies of African or Indian countries from the Age of Sail? I've never been able to find out much, if anything at all, about ships from India, and let alone less than from the Mediterranean parts of Africa. In theory, yes, I would like to cover them because they're part of naval history. In practice, it is somewhat more difficult, though, because A, not a huge amount is written about them compared to the volumes and volumes and volumes that's been written about for Western ships of the line and Age of Sail vessels. But secondly, what information there is tends to fall into one of two categories. Either it's very difficult to access or even know about if it exists. So, published in local languages by local historians who understandably are interested in their local history, but for which an English translation has never been made. So tracking those kinds of things down can be very difficult because, there's a difference between tracking down a hard-to-find book that exists, but tracking down a book that you might not even know exists and may not even exist that's in a foreign language that you don't speak is exponentially harder. So it's essentially a problem of finding sources in the first place, but then mixed in with that, depending on which navy or which nation you're looking at, where there is sometimes available sources, those sources can be what I would term contentious. So an example of what I was speaking about before would be, for example, Glorioso, the Spanish ship of the line. Now, there is information out there in English about the voyage of the Glorioso, but nothing that goes into massively great detail. But because I knew about Glorioso and because there was a certain amount of information in the English language, I was able to relatively easily, it still took me a couple of weeks, track down some decent books in Spanish about Glorioso, acquire them, get them shipped over to the UK, and then translate them, and hence that's where the video on Glorioso came from. But coming back to the second point about contentious sources, sometimes there will be one or two articles or books or papers or statements or whatever out there about some ship that was built in a far distant country hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But weirdly, there's more consensus on things like how triremes were built. And if any of you know anything about the Greco-Roman naval history field, you'll know that there's still a lot of discussion about exactly how triremes were laid out internally. But there's still an awful lot more that we think we probably do know about triremes than is reliably statable about a lot of these other ships, like the ones you indicated. I mean, take, for example, one of the slightly better known ones, the Chinese treasure ships of Zheng He. We all know they existed, and we know they were pretty big, but exactly how big? Well, there's a variety of different original sources that give different sizes or different lengths. Then there's a dispute over the unit of measurement that's used in the first place. And then there's various modern interpretations by various scholars as to what could be the true size of these vessels. And the consensus on exactly what that is seems to change every 5 to 10 years or so. And now, although some people will say, oh, yes, there is a consensus, not really. There's a majority faction, and I would put a lowercase m on that, in as much as they are the largest faction and they advocate for a certain size range, but there are quite a number of smaller entrenched factions who argue for both upper and lower limits to that are obviously greater or smaller. And that's one of the reasons why I haven't done much about or anything about Zheng He's ships other than answering the odd question about them in the Drydock, because I'd love to do a video or two about Zheng He's treasure fleet and his voyages, but I can absolutely guarantee you that whatever I say about the ship's size, shape, capabilities, and structure, there will be a bunch of people who will be very angry about whatever I say and will contradict it one way or the other, and B, whatever scholarly sources I use to back up what I say, 5 years down the line, everything may well have changed. So kind of get your house in order, people, and then I'll be more happy to talk about the treasure ships in anything but the highest level of detail. And I say those are ships that are actually, relatively speaking, well known when it comes to things like the Mughal and Maharatha navies, which I'm reusing this picture relatively swiftly after using it in a previous Drydock. Yeah, let's just say there are some impressively nationalistic people out there from the Indian subcontinent who really don't help themselves, because they hugely muddy the waters of what the heck is actually going on with these ships. Because again, they're pretty interesting, all things considered. But, trying to find obviously an article in Bengali or any other one of the major languages of the Indian subcontinent that deals with these ships in the first place, that is hard enough. And then working out, is this particular book article worth my time in acquiring or translating, is a whole other factor. Because from the small attempts I've made into that area of things, trying to figure out, is there enough information for me to talk about in any kind of coherent manner that's backed up by scholarship? I've got, I think, 4 articles on them in, let's say, in various Indian languages. Fortunately, they're obviously downloadable rather than having to pay for them. And of those, I would say one actually offers some pretty decent insights into what they did, but doesn't say a huge amount about the ships themselves. Another potentially has some interesting information about the ships and how they were constructed, but the tone of the whole paper makes me slightly suspicious about some of the figures that are being given. But the figures are close enough to some of what ships like the East India Company ships and the Royal Navy ships talked about, that while there may be a little bit of exaggeration, it's probably not a huge amount. And then the other 2 are basically garbage. I question why I even bother using the storage space on my computer to hold them, because they are so obviously works of modern propaganda that whatever minor trace elements of truth they might have in them are completely subsumed in a tidal wave of frankly trash. I mean, one of them insists that the Mughal flagship was a ship of the line, or at least that's what the closest thing the translation can come to, which was more than capable of challenging the largest European ships and winning. And I'm sitting there going, I'm sorry, mate, but there is zero archaeological evidence, or any evidence of any description, really, that there was ever a Mughal 3-decker warship of, 180 to 200 feet long, mounting 100 guns. That just doesn't exist outside of the fever dreams of some very interesting and slightly peculiar people. But somehow this made it to publication. And this is another problem. It's like, I don't know what internal Indian historical publications and journals are like. Which ones are reliable, which ones are, just somebody's fancy, way of getting their name out there. So for all I know, that could be the view of some rather special scholars in India, and they may be tolerated in greater academic circles, or it could be somebody's vanity press article and has about as much relevance as somebody who insists that Admiral Nelson was in fact a talking parrot in the West. I just don't know. So, yeah, much as I would like to cover those ships, somebody needs to point me towards some decent sources, ideally in English, but even if they are in local languages, I'm happy to try and get them translated, as long as there's, a reasonable amount of academic rigor to them so that it's not just a gigantic waste of time. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, during the medieval period, we see vessels with 4 masts, then we see them drop to 3 for most of the Age of Sail, and then at the very end of the Age of Sail, we see a return of the 4th mast, now often called a Bonaventure, and then we also see vessels with 5 or 6 masts. Why did this happen, and why did the maximum number of masts drop to 3 in the first place, and then why did the 4+ masts make a comeback later on? So there's a combination of factors going on. So the 4-mast ship in the Tudor period, like this is Henry Glassadieu, aka Great Harry. You can see it has the 2 aft lateen masts. These were quite rare. Only the very largest ships would carry 4 masts. Most of the big ships would carry 3. Now, the reason this was dropped is because these ships were still, relatively speaking, small, and because of the very high fore and stern castles, or after castle, depending on your terminology, having large masts, like your main mast, mounted up on these castles wasn't very practical for spacing reasons, weight reasons, and stability reasons. And so having smaller masts that then had lateen sails that helped you maneuver into the wind, those were quite handy on very large ships which needed every bit of sail area that they could get. However, as ships got fractionally larger and sail and mast technology advanced, it became fairly rapidly clear that actually it was far more efficient to combine, at least on big ships, your mizzen and Bonaventure masts into one larger mizzen mast, and then that mizzen mast, instead of just being a lateen sail mast, which again you can kind of see here, would instead have either a more standard square sail up top and then a lateen or triangular mast below, or as time went on, the mizzen would have a full spread of square sail, and if you wanted a fore and aft vaguely triangular or trapezoidal sail to help you with tacking into the wind, then you'd have a boom that came off of that mast going aft from which you could have a sail. And that's kind of the format that you see by the Napoleonic Wars. And it's just much more efficient. It saves on weight, it saves on space, and it allows you to mount a great deal of sail area to generate forward momentum under most circumstances, while still retaining in some way, shape or form the fore and aft sails, which will allow you to, let's say, tack closer into the wind. And also, if you've got 3 really big secure masts, you can also string more fore and aft sails between them, which were occasionally done as well. But then, as you go into the mid-19th century, you see 4, 5, 6 masts coming back into vogue. And that really depends on what ship you're seeing them on. The broad category is essentially that even if they are still sail-powered ships, a lot of them are either very heavily iron-reinforced or just iron-hulled, and therefore they are much larger and critically much longer than old-school wooden vessels, at which point they also displace more, which means they need more force to move through the water, and they now have the hull length to fit 4, 5, 6 masts, which it's not just a case of we've got the space for it, it's we need that much sail area, that much canvas to generate enough forward momentum for us to actually be worthwhile. So you end up with ships like the Minotaur class ironclad, which have, at least initially, 5 masts. But if you diverge off into merchant ships, again, they're getting considerably longer, but they also have another factor going in, which is that they use multiple smaller sails, because then you can get away with having a smaller crew, which is necessary, obviously, for a profit-driven merchant ship. But since having multiple smaller sails is marginally less efficient than having a few larger sails, it makes it even more imperative to have more masts to carry more acreage of canvas. Andrew Snow asks, or possibly Andrews now, anyway, he asks, was the Anthony Roll more of a planning document, i.e. what the provisions aboard should be, or was it more of an inventory of what was actually found on board at a single point in time? I think it's a little bit of a mix, honestly, because some of the specifications for the numbers of people aboard, soldiers, sailors, gunners, etc., are so odd, as in literally like odd numbers, that don't make sense in any kind of scaling system, that I suspect that's almost certainly exactly the number of crew who were aboard at the point that he was making the record. Similarly, when it comes to the guns, there are all sorts of weird and wonderful guns listed, and sometimes only present in 1s and 2s, and sometimes present in multiple. So again, I suspect that probably fairly accurately reflects what the ships were actually carrying. But once you get down into the slightly smaller stores, things like numbers of longbows, feet of timber, coils of rope, that kind of stuff, I suspect most of that is probably idealized, because you can see when you look through all of it, there are very clearly certain ratios between, number of bows, number of bowstrings, number of sheaves of arrows, all of that kind of stuff. And you can almost see the formula that's being worked out there to, or number of bills, for example, number of pikes. So I suspect that if you went on board any given ship, you wouldn't have exactly 420 longbows or whatever. It would be somewhere in that region, and that's how much they're supposed to carry. But you might have a few staves short, or a few more. There might be a few sheaves of arrows short, or there might be a few more, that kind of stuff. Powder, I suspect, was probably pretty accurate, because that stuff was expensive and obviously quite sensitive. But I think a lot of the rest of it would either be, this is what they're supposed to have, rather than necessarily what they strictly do have, or if it is what they have, it'll be because the ship is kind of in ordinary in port, and somebody's been able to very carefully ensure that exactly what's supposed to be on board is in fact on board. Tumas Kisk asks, during the Battle of the Strait of Otranto, the Italian and overall Allied commander, Admiral Alfredo Acton, himself curiously enough of British descent, flew his flag on the British HMS Dartmouth. My question is, why did he choose a Royal Navy vessel over any of the available Italian ships, such as the cruiser Marsala or the large destroyer Aquila? Sure, Dartmouth might have been bigger than any of the Italian scouting vessels, but the flagship doesn't always have to be the biggest one around. And are there other instances where an admiral would fly his flag in a foreign ship? And if so, why? From what I can tell, it was a matter of simple expediency in the case of the Strait of Otranto, because at the time that word reached Brindisi, the Italian port where everybody was staying, none of the larger Italian vessels actually had any steam up in their boilers, with the exception of the Marsala, and she didn't have a huge amount of steam in her boilers as compared to the Dartmouth, which had most of its steam worked up already. And so it was a case of, well, for Acton, which ship that is suitable for serving as a flagship is capable of leaving first, bearing in mind they're obviously pulling a rapid reaction to the Austro-Hungarian forces. And the simple fact was Dartmouth was going to be one of, if not the first large ship to be able to leave by quite some margin. And so he was just like, well, I guess we're going aboard Dartmouth then, because that would actually get him to the action as opposed to sending a bunch of relatively large and valuable ships out there while he just kind of sat on shore waiting for somebody else's boilers to spool up. And generally speaking, for a whole plethora of political and practical reasons, most of the time flag officers will prefer to hoist their flags aboard ships of their own navies. Far too many really to go into in a Drydock answer, but suffice to say, pretty much the only time, and there have been other times that admirals have flown their flags in foreign warships, but pretty much the only times it will occur is when there is a very, very pressing and urgent need to do something, and a suitable vessel from their own navy just flat out isn't available for whatever reason. And that could be ability to communicate. It could be, as in this case, ability to actually get out to sea and engage. It could be that all suitable flagships of their own navy have been damaged in some way, shape or form that makes them unsuitable for frontline action. But it has to be some very, very niche circumstances to force an admiral to hoist his flag on a ship that isn't from the navy that he is part of. Chief Eyeroll asks, what type of mines did the Japanese deploy during World War II? And in mine warfare before the Washington Naval Treaty, did the Japanese have a particularly close relationship with the Royal Navy and share in mine or mine countermeasures technology? While there certainly was some informational exchange with regard to mines and mine warfare in World War I and the surrounding period around the Anglo-Japanese Treaty, the Japanese Navy never seems to have taken a huge amount of interest in mines, at least in the World War I into World War II period. These are some of the mines the Japanese use, you can see here. They are very classical, almost cartoon-like mines. Big spheres, Hertz horns stuck on them, although obviously in this case, obviously in storage they haven't had them stuck on, but they would be for deployment, although they don't have quite as many as a cartoon mine. And honestly, most of the Japanese mines were, at least by World War II standards, relatively small and relatively weak. Their charges were usually about a third to half what you'd find in most other nations' submarine and surface ship deployed mines. They did have a few aerial deployed mines, but their charges, if anything, were even weaker. And a lot of that seems to have stemmed from the Japanese idea that the Navy would be an offensive tool. And of course, a Navy on the offense doesn't need, at least in Japanese doctrine, to lay minefields, because minefields are the tool of a defensive Navy. And so, while the mines that they were using in terms of power would not be too shabby by World War I standards, by World War II standards they were a fair bit behind the curve. About the only sort of really interesting mine that the Japanese seem to have come up with, at least prior to the very end of the war, when they were kind of forced into a very defensive mindset, was one that they had deployed on anti-submarine nets, which I think was actually quite clever in that it didn't depend on the submarine contacting the mine directly, but what it did was it measured the tension on the submarine net, and if the tension of the bit of the net that it was attached to exceeded a certain amount, then the mine would detonate, essentially on the principle that if the tension in the net is increasing, therefore something is pushing against the net somewhere nearby, and if it goes up past a certain point, then obviously there's a submarine in the net somewhere nearby, so detonating at this point would be very handy. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, were there any plans to use the Mark 24 Fido Mine, i.e. homing torpedo, from surface escorts, or to apply its technology to a ship-launched weapon? As far as I'm aware, there weren't any direct plans to use the Mark 24 specifically from surface escorts. There were a number of developmental strands during the mid to late part of World War II where the US Navy was trying to come up with an acoustic homing torpedo for anti-submarine use to be launched from surface ships, because, well, they had the Fido, as you can see here, for dropping from aircraft. They had the QT for launching from submarines, primarily against surface targets, but they didn't have anything for surface targets to take on submarines. But a number of the programs that potentially could have resulted in something during the Second World War were terminated, as some of the other developmental programs seemed to show a bit more promise, even if some of them then stumbled and fell later on. But eventually there would be some programs that resulted in surface-launched weapons. So, for example, the Mark 32 torpedo and the Mark 35 torpedo, they were both under development during the very late stages of World War II. So the Mark 35 was being designed in 1944. And towards the end of the 1940s, you see the Mark 32, paradoxically, which is a slightly earlier Mark number. But when you look at the Mark 32 does very, very closely resemble the Fido and the Cutie, but wasn't in service for all that long. So there definitely were plans on taking the acoustic homing technology found in the Fido and the Cutie and applying it to a ship-launched weapon, but it didn't see service during the Second World War. Primarily, as far as I can tell, there seem to have been concerns about the launch method, i.e. how to get it clear of a surface escort, and then once it's in the water, how to stop it just turning around and immediately coming back after the launch platform itself. Obviously, with aircraft, you don't need to worry about that because the acoustic system won't be able to hear the aircraft, and even if it could, it can't do anything about it. And from submarines, yes, you're kicking the torpedo out of the tube, but it's going from a flooded tube into water as opposed to being flung through the air and then smacking into the water. And ultimately, a submarine is, generally speaking, somewhat quieter than a surface escort, at least for that period. Alternate historian Turtleduck asks, in a mobile game called Atlantic Fleet, the victory conditions for the Kriegsmarine to win the Battle of the Atlantic is to sink over 300,000 tons of merchant ships in a month, and later 700,000 per month when the US enters the war in 1941. Is this an accurate estimate to force Britain out of the war? And if not, what amount of tonnage would be more realistic? And similar, what's the amount of tonnage needed in World War I? Well, for the First World War, we actually have a pretty good idea of exactly how much per month you need to sink in order to make the British think that they're going to have to bow out the war pretty sharpish, because the one period where the Germans managed to score that level of success was in the early part of 1917. And if we look at graphs of tonnage loss, as opposed to numbers of ships lost, because in World War I a lot more small ships were hit, but in terms of tonnage losses in early 1917, you see that they hover around 500,000 to 600,000 tons. There's a couple of months where they score considerably more, but 500,000 to 600,000 tons a month was a kind of a level of sustained loss that the Germans managed to inflict in the first half of 1917. And that's the period when pretty much every British officer of the time said, yeah, if this keeps going, we're going to be out in a few months because this is unsustainable. So let's say, as a low-end estimate for World War I, 500,000 tons of shipping per month. For World War II, the figure is a little bit more difficult to arrive at, simply because the U-boats never actually got to that point. So we don't have a hard and fast, yeah, this is the unsustainable level, the way that we do for 1917. However, I would reckon that the 300,000 tons per month is probably not accurate. Partly because that's less than the World War I figure. And secondly, because if you look at the shipbuilding rates, just in Britain, not even accounting for the US and its Liberty ships, because Britain was actually building merchant shipping during World War II. People seem to forget that sometimes. But Britain on its own was actually outbuilding that theoretical 300,000 ton loss rate. And in fact, for the most part, in the early part of the war, they were outbuilding the loss rate generally for most months. So British shipbuilding, incidentally, if you're looking at merchant ship construction, was averaging around 350,000 tons per month, maybe a little bit more than that because the figure varied. Sometimes it was a little bit below 300,000 tons, sometimes it was over 450,000, depending on when hulls were coming into service. But average 350 to 375,000 tons, which means that if you're sinking 300,000 tons of merchant ships a month, the British merchant fleet is actually still going to be growing. Now, of course, there are plenty more factors to bring in, because you've got things like the loss of the cargoes themselves. They need to be replaced, the financial cost of that, how vital those cargoes are, as in, if this cargo arrives on its scheduled arrival date, then we can do this. But if that ship gets sunk, yes, we can replace it. But to organise the replacement, then, if it's a month and a half until, I don't know, a consignment of ball bearings arrives, does that cripple our aircraft engine production for a bit? If the aircraft engine production is crippled, can we not produce fighters? If we can't produce fighters, do we lose an air war? That kind of thing. This is all the very complex nature of convoy warfare. But you've also got to account for the fact that simply by sailing in convoys, you're actually reducing the overall amount of shipping that's coming through to the UK, because instead of ships sailing as and when the cargo is ready, they're having to wait until the convoy is ready, which in and of itself is something of a throttle. So just using raw tonnage sunk figures, I'd say, is a very rough shorthand for how successful is the convoy war being. But my ballpark would probably be maybe 500 to 550,000 tons of merchant shipping sunk per month by U-boats in order to knock Britain out of the war prior to the Liberty and Victory ship building spree. Which I think is why you can see 1942 was the year that the British really, really, really didn't like the Battle of the Atlantic, because while the Germans didn't quite meet that threshold for the whole year, if you divide the total tonnage of ships sunk in 1942 by U-boats over the 12 months, you'll see that that's the time they got the closest to averaging out that amount. Stefan Perrault asks, could you please give your top 3 incompetent admirals and why? Admirals being in active command of a ship or squadron, not as in commander-in-chief. Well, no surprise at all, I'm including Beatty on this list, and perhaps also not much of a surprise, I'm also including Villeneuve, but we'll get on to my third choice later on. So Beatty is on the list for reasons that, well, those of you who've listened to my channel for any extensive period of time will already know, but the short version was he selected subordinates largely on the basis of whether he liked them personally or not because they were necessarily actually good at their jobs, which, while definitely not ideal, you could at least understand or explain, if not justify, in a peacetime sort of coming out of the late Victorian period Navy. However, this is wartime, and once it becomes clear that his subordinates really can't actually do their job as well as they should do, that's when you use your prestige and influence to find them a nice position that doesn't involve the security of the nation depending on their highly questionable skills. So, massive error in judgment there. Then you've got the fact that, dodgy signalling aside, he seems fundamentally incapable of understanding complex ship tactics for large-scale fleet maneuvers. And you see that repeatedly. Dogger Bank and Jutland, he doesn't give the best orders to set up for an action in the first place. And once the action is joined, even the orders he gives, much as they don't really get through to everybody else, really aren't the best thought out at all. I mean, the whole, letting the Germans get close enough that they're the ones who open fire first at Jutland, despite the British ships having considerably longer range, is largely down to the fact he's trying to micromanage the positioning of the battle cruisers, so they're more worried about station keeping and adjusting course according to the orders of the fleet commander rather than being able to stabilize their rangefinders and make the necessary calculations for opening fire. And then, of course, ultimately, he is in command of the fleet screen, the scouting unit. He's supposed to tell, his entire purpose for existence in the Grand Fleet is to tell the Grand Fleet what is going on and where they need to be to bring their firepower to bear. And he completely fails to do that job, and it's down to one of his subordinates in one of the light cruiser squadrons to give Jellicoe even the faintest hint that anything is actually going on in any given direction. So, yeah. And then, of course, he manages to set Admiral King off on a very long bout of Anglophobia by doing a fleet exercise, realizing he doesn't actually have a clue how to handle a fleet in anything other than a flat calm and light breezes. And instead of trying to learn or lean on his subordinates or do anything, he just throws his hands up in the air and cancels the whole thing like a petulant child. Villeneuve, and I think actually Villeneuve and Beatty share a certain common characteristic, which is that both Villeneuve and Beatty, in my opinion, they're not entirely incompetent naval officers. They would make excellent ship captains or perhaps squadron or flotilla leaders within the scope of a larger fleet, i.e. if you put Beatty or Villeneuve in command of a capital ship or a small unit of capital ships, but you have a larger overall admiral in command who tells them what to do, both Villeneuve and Beatty actually have track records that would suggest in Beatty's case, and in Villeneuve's case it actually can be proven directly, that they do a pretty good job at that level. They're just terrible choices to be the ones in charge of actually making those decisions. Villeneuve, of course, Trafalgar being the pièce de résistance of that particular case, he is far too nervous. I mean, yes, okay, the Spanish and French fleets are not quite as good at sea as the British, but he is far, far too nervous even for what he has in terms of where he goes and who he engages and when in the whole run-up to the Trafalgar campaign. And then once the battle is actually set up, not only does he fail to do a lot of basic training while in port, because yes, you can't train your sailors in how to actually sail ships if they're stuck in Cadiz for ages, but you can train them in close quarters boarding actions, and while you can't necessarily train them a lot in actual gunnery, you can train them in loading drill. That doesn't necessarily require you to fire the guns, but you can get your firing rate up a fair bit. But he doesn't seem to try to instigate any kind of widespread training measures like that while the fleet is in port, and pretty much the competent ships in the Franco-Spanish fleet, where they either have something approaching decent gunnery or more often a fairly good close quarters game, is largely down to the impetus and initiative of individual captains rather than something that you find generally spread throughout the fleet. So he completely fails to prepare his fleet for the actual battle they're being asked to fight, as well as being far too timid about the whole thing. And then when he's confronted with his nightmare of, hey, Nelson's coming for him, not only does he decide at the last minute to reverse his orders and therefore reverse the order of his fleet, but he does so in weather conditions that leave the Franco-Spanish fleet incredibly strung out and disorganized, which is basically laying out a welcome mat for Nelson's tactics. Literally, Villeneuve doing anything other than what he did probably would have allowed the Franco-Spanish fleet not necessarily a strong chance at victory, but at least a chance at not being so spectacularly defeated at Trafalgar. And if we're going to keep to maybe the last few hundred years, I would probably also then have to nominate Admiral Persano from the Battle of Lissa of the Regia Marina, because although there are a number of issues with the Regia Marina at the time, including a lot of interpersonal rivalries, which compromised their fighting ability compared to the on-paper statistics between the two fleets, there is, that, and then there's, I'm going to leave my flagship and set up shop on another ship right before or in the initial stages of battle, depending on your source and the exact timings they give, and I'm not going to tell anybody. So in an era when the only way to know what your admiral wants you to do is to look to the flagship for flag orders, and thanks to you not telling anyone that you've moved ship, everyone's looking at the wrong ship, I mean, that's a pretty blinding display of incompetence, to my mind. Even if you're going to move flagship at all, that's probably the terrible idea in the circumstances. But if you are going to do that, at least leave standing orders with that ship to hoist a permanent signal that says something along the lines of, we're not the flagship anymore, that one is. So at least the rest of the fleet knows where they should be looking. Michael Gilson asks, the Japanese developed the formidable Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden from the Kawanishi N1K Kyufu floatplane. If the Germans had developed a wheeled version of the Arado 196, would they have gotten a better naval attack plane for the Graf Zeppelin and for land-based use? Well, I think it's important, first of all, to emphasize that the Arado 196 was supposed to be a recon aircraft. Now, obviously, yes, if you take the floats off, you are going to save weight, but then you need to put wheeled landing gear on. And not being an aviation historian, I don't know what the exact ratio of weight savings is of removing floats but adding landing gear. And, do you have fixed landing gear, retractable landing gear? Obviously, in World War II, most people want retractable landing gear, but retractable landing gear way more than fixed landing gear. Fixed landing gear have more impact on your aerodynamics. So would the Arado 196 see a performance boost with landing gear instead of floats? I mean, probably it would have less drag apart from anything else, but whether that would meaningfully increase its payload and by how much, I don't know. The sort of more aviation-minded people out there might be able to tell you. But with all that said and done, I definitely wouldn't want a wheeled Arado 196 as a land-based attack aircraft, because being a initially reconnaissance aircraft, it's not particularly fast, it's not particularly durable. It could be surprisingly agile at times, but that's for a floatplane recon aircraft. It's still not going to be winning dogfights with Spitfires and Hurricanes and P-47s and P-51s later on and all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah, definitely not for land-based use. For carrier-based use, however, perhaps on the Graf Zeppelin, I think it would come down to how much of a payload can the poor thing actually carry if you switch over to landing gear. It is a slightly smaller and considerably lighter aircraft than a Ju-87, which is what they eventually settled on using on the Graf Zeppelin if it had ever been constructed. And then you also have the biplane, the Fi-167, which was designed as a torpedo bomber, which is actually a lot closer in terms of power plant and payload and overall weight and size to the Arado 196, but is overall a somewhat better strike aircraft, just looking at paper stats. Now, of course, the paper stats might increase with a wheeled version of the Arado 196, but I think at the very, very least, you would want to put a significantly more powerful engine on the poor thing to get it to be a viable attack aircraft. But, with all that said, with huge caveats, an up-engined, wheeled Arado 196, given the general performance characteristics of an Arado 196, might make a viable strike aircraft for the Graf Zeppelin, because I think its takeoff characteristics and landing characteristics would be relatively forgiving. But, of course, this is me offering my opinion as a naval historian talking about an aircraft. So, again, as I said, if you have any opinions out there, if you happen to be a lot more aviation-minded, let me know. But it would be, my opinion would be, it would be okay. I don't think it would be particularly wonderful. Ash the Lego guy asks, why did ammunition for the main guns of the Italian Navy in World War II have such low or wide tolerances which led to poor accuracy when their guns and optics were generally among the higher end of their contemporaries? Now, I have talked about this a few times over the years on the channel, so if you're a long-time viewer, you may already know what I'm about to say. But for the sake of new viewers, my views on this have actually evolved over time. So half a decade ago or so, mostly because it was the most information that was available in English and readily accessible, I was of the opinion that, as per some Italian officers' post-war memorandums, that the main problem had been the ammunition quality, specifically the fact that tolerances for both shell weight and charge weight were quite varied. And to be honest, when you added up the explosive power of a shell that was, or a charge that was 1.5% lighter with a shell that was the same degree heavier, and then you flipped it around and had a much stronger charge with a lighter shell, it did seem to roughly correlate with some of the ridiculous spreads that you got in some engagements. Now, the one thing that was always a little bit odd was that obviously spread of shell increases the further the shell fires, but sometimes in the engagements you would have a spread that was actually reasonably good or actually quite tight, and it was just pure luck that you didn't hit anything. Unfortunately for the Italians, this tended roughly to correlate with particularly long-range engagements where you wouldn't expect to hit much anyway. But then in other times you would get rather disastrous spreads. And the traditional explanation for this was that, well, occasionally some of the shells and charges were actually, within tolerance, decent quality, and thus you would get decent spreads. And for the information that was available at the time, as I said, that seemed to make a certain degree of sense. Although on reflection now, I think you could look back and say, well, hang on, if you have very variable shell and charge qualities, and you've got 3 separate magazines with a mixture of shells and charges that will have been loaded up, because obviously you'll have your initial loadout, and then you fire some off, and then you have some loaded up, and then you'll want to get rid of your older ammo, and then you'll eat a little bit into your newer ammo, and then you'll have another partial reload, and then you're splitting that between 3 separate turrets, 3 separate guns per turret. Having all the shells suddenly working, getting good quality for all the charges and all the shells all at once, and then not another time round, that seems perhaps in retrospect a little bit odd. Nonetheless, my opinion now is based on more research that's been done by Italian historians, and critically, research that's been done by Italian historians that is now available in English to the wider naval historian community. Much like, there's been a fair bit that the Japanese historians knew about the Japanese Navy in World War II that they knew for ages, and in the English-speaking world we didn't know because no one had bothered to translate it. Nonetheless, since there's been more research done by Italian historians, more Italian historians on the global stage as far as naval history goes, and more research done just generally, my opinion, as I say, has changed. And I think the thing that changed my mind the most was an article, I think it was a couple of years ago now, in Warship International by Bill Jurens, and in cooperation with a number of Italian historians, if I remember correctly. And what they pointed out was that it's actually far more likely that the issue was of inaccuracy was with overstabilization of the Italian shells. And what's meant by that is that the Italian guns had a 1 in 30 rifling twist, which is pretty similar to a lot of other naval guns of the time, but of course they're firing incredibly fast, as in the muzzle velocity is very fast. That means that if they're traveling faster, with the same 1 in 30 ratio of rifling, the amount of spin on the shell is actually considerably greater. Now, as most people who have looked into ballistics or understand ballistics will know, you need a certain amount of spin on your projectile to maintain accuracy. If the amount of spin is too low, the shell will end up tumbling end over end, or bullet if you're looking at smaller guns. But if it's overstabilized, if you're looking at a rifle or something, that may not be too much of an issue at typical engagement ranges. But when you're talking about a heavy artillery gun that's firing in a very high ballistic arc, that can be a problem, because the rifling giving the spin makes the shell stay pointed forward. But if it's overstabilized, i.e. it's got a lot of spin, too much spin, then you fire the shell pointing at a given angle, and it will stay pointing at that given angle or close to it, regardless of what the shell is actually doing. So the sweet spot is to have just enough spin so that the shell is pointing in the direction you want it to go, and it keeps doing that. But as you lose energy and the shell tips over and starts heading down, the shell should, approximately speaking, keep its nose on that trajectory so that when it arrives, the nose is still pointing in the direction of travel. If it's overstabilized, it will tend to just keep pointing. Let's say if you fired it at 30 degrees upwards, it'll try to kind of keep pointing at that 30-degree angle. And then that means it's essentially doing a kind of space shuttle re-entry, almost belly first effect as it comes back down, which is not particularly aerodynamic. And now it's also spinning perpendicular to the direction of travel, potentially, or not quite perpendicular, but close to it. So you could also get a Magnus effect style drift going on there. And that's going to make your shell relatively inaccurate. Now, that does make a lot of sense given the muzzle velocity of the Italian guns, the nature of the shells, and the nature of the twist in the rifling. But it also actually explains why at times the Italian spread would be good, and at other times it would be bad, and at other times it would be okay. And that would be simply because the Italian guns have a very, very short barrel life compared to everybody else's. And we know what happens as the barrel life decreases, the rifling wears, and you start to get less and less rotation on the shells, which in turn means that the shells become less and less stable in flight. And we actually see this with the 15-inch gun monitor that the British have on the coast of North Africa in World War II. It's stuck out there for so long, it shoots its guns out to the point that they're effectively smooth bores, and they become almost useless because the shells are now basically having almost no spin stabilization, so they're tumbling end over end and detonating in midair and all sorts of shenanigans like this. Now, if you're firing regular guns that have a 300 to 400 round per barrel life, the incremental change is very small. But if you're looking at the Italian guns that can, barely manage just over 100 rounds per gun before they need relining, then the change in the amount of spin that you're getting per shot is actually quite considerable. That in turn means that if you do have this overstabilization problem to start with, then when your guns are relatively new, they are going to be fairly inaccurate. So, you shoot them, you get the overstabilization, and you're going to get very wide spreads. But as you shoot the guns through their life, which, as I say, with a very short lifespan, you could do fairly quickly. So, you take your ship out on gunnery exercises, and then you have a little bit of an action, or perhaps you've just redone the guns and the ship gets called out for action, and then you do gunnery exercises afterwards. What you're going to end up with is very, very different amounts of spin in each case. If you're firing off, let's say, a dozen salvos, that's going to result in a 10 to 15% variance in the amount of spin you're going to get compared from, maximum to the gun has been shot out. So I think what's personally, based on that research that Bill Jones and others have done, I think what's actually happening with the Italians is that they're overstabilized and very inaccurate very early in the barrel life. And as you shoot through the barrel life, which as I happens quite quickly, then what's happening is you're getting less and less spin stabilization, which means that actually the spin stabilization is dropping through a range where it's actually reasonably decent, which in turn means now your spread is quite good. And then, of course, you run out of barrel life very quickly. You go back to change the barrel and the whole cycle starts over again. So where you see Italian battleships shooting spreads where the spread is within what you'd expect for a decent battleship gun, they've probably, I would expect, shot through about half their barrel life or more, and you're actually getting a little bit of wear and slippage going on. Whereas the times when you see a very, very wide spread, I suspect if somebody really dug in, I suspect you'd find that correlates very well with them receiving recently relined new guns. Although, of course, that would require somebody with access to the Italian archives to do a heck of a lot more research to verify that, but I strongly suspect that would be the case. And as I mentioned in some other videos, you can see evidence of this disastrous level of spread in some actual live action photos taken from the various ships from the Royal Navy who are being shot at by the Italians. And there's a few rather famous ones which I've showcased here before, which when you calculate even at a very, 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 very conservative estimate, which is being far too generous because the shell splashes are actually further away than the ship you're using to measure, that spread is in the order of about half a mile, or pushing close to it, and that's with a single turret, 3-shell salvo that's landing, let alone what a full salvo might do. And that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and I hope to see you again in another video soon. Bye for now.